Hello and welcome back to Space to Live. How's everyone doing? A warm welcome to our guests for tonight, Nick Howes, and this time not Terry, but we've got Stephen Ringler on the show tonight. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Hey Steve, hey Nick, how's it going?
Good. Tip top.
Awesome. Well, everyone, strap in for another great show of the Space Roundup. This is where we bring you the latest and greatest of space news. Thank you for watching if you're watching this on catch up, or thank you for the listeners who are joining us live. Remember to hit the subscribe button on YouTube if you haven't already, and follow us on our social media channels across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and now even TikTok, to make sure you're staying up to date with everything Space Store. And with that, I'll hand you guys over to our wonderful guest for tonight to talk about some really interesting topics of what's been happening in space over the last month or so.
Cool. Thanks, Latch. Good to see you here, Stephen. If you're wondering where Terry is, Terry is currently, it's 2:28 in the morning where Terry is, because he is in the east coast of Australia right now, having just hopefully, and I bet he has seen one of the most remarkable solar eclipses in recent times, principally because it was so clear. Having been to some of these eclipses, I was in the one in China in 2009, I think it was. Very luckily got to see it because we were at Hangzhou, but I know that millions of people in Shanghai and various other locations were completely oblivious to it. They didn't really get to see it much at all, which is a real shame. If you are in the audience and listening, or you're watching on catch up, as I said, and you do ever get a chance to see an eclipse, and obviously we had the one in the UK, which was a bit of a washout in 1999. Some of you may remember it. Some of you may like to forget it because it really didn't happen in Cornwall. It happened for people out in the middle of the channel, apparently, and in northern France, but there we go. It is an amazing thing to see, and it's one of the things we would have talked about, and we will do next month, obviously, when Terry's back, all being well, in our look-up section. But as I said, we've got a load on. Now, Stephen, I'll just introduce Stephen for those of you who don't know him. Stephen is the man behind Space Store. I met Stephen, oh gosh, good few years ago now, when my company were based a lot more up at Harwell at the Oxford Space kind of campus cluster at Harwell. And Stephen was in the kind of foyer area there with some wonderful goodies. And it's like, we just ended up chatting and grabbing a coffee. And we've just become firm friends ever since. It's been a real pleasure knowing and seeing the company grow from that tiny little stall and the ideas that he had into turn it into what is now Space Store, with a fantastic location in the centre of one of the most beautiful cities in the world, in Oxford. So, Stephen, what's been happening with you? Let's just start off with you first, and then we'll go on
thanks
to
so
our
much
Space
for
Store.
letting me crash the party tonight. I was telling Nick earlier that I'm a little intimidated to be here because I get so much of my updates around the space industry from Nick and Terry. So huge shoes to fill from Terry. So I won't try to fill them. I'll just be myself. But yeah, things are going well. We have our shop up in Oxford. We're doing all sorts of fun experiences. We're about to launch a new experience around the overview effect with a new partner, which is pretty exciting. We've started a holiday club for kids 5 to 11. So just trying to get in early, get in young to really influence the young people, inspire them into thinking about working in the space industry and all the great things that it has to offer. So yeah, I'm doing really well. Really glad to be here. Look forward to chatting tonight about all sorts of really interesting things happening in our industry.
And it's really interesting you say that about inspiration. One of the things that a lot of organizations and especially academia try to measure is what they call their impact on, outreach and STEM, etc. And I know you've put in so much effort into really getting kids involved in particular, which is fantastic, because that's the thing. Kids are all interested in two things: dinosaurs and space. If you get them at an early enough age and you really fire up that passion, it's going to translate into potentially the future space scientists that we need. And it leads us really nicely onto our opening story, and that is the future of UK spaceflight. So normally Terry and I would kind of go through news items and whatever, but we're going to treat this as almost like a bit more of an informal conversation between Stephen and I, where we're going to kind of share our own thoughts, really. Now, UK space flight, as we know, it's a big thing. There's 47,000 people in the UK who work in the space section, space industry, and we hear all sorts of figures cited about how big it is for the economy, and those figures are generally a little bit loose with the truth, putting it nicely, because a lot of it is reliant on like direct TV from satellite broadcast, Sky and the like of them, and direct television, things like sports broadcast, football broadcast, etc., were in the past a huge revenue stream. That is now really decreased. It's quite significantly smaller than it was. So this huge number that's usually quoted by people like the UK Space Agency as to the size of the UK space economy isn't really true, but it is growing and it is big, and there are large players involved in this in the UK. And everybody, when people think about spaceflight, they normally think about human spaceflight. And you go back to the Apollo era and the Gemini era and the Mercury era, and what the Russians have done. And the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle and Tim Peake, all through that tends to get the highest profile. But the UK has got a massive sector involvement in space, as it were, from things like instrumentation and design and research and development. And companies like Airbus, even though they're a French company, there's a huge Airbus kind of institution over here that does so much work for the European Space Agency and various other agencies. And then you've got Thales Alenia. You've got lots of multinational companies who are very heavily centered in the UK for their production pipelines, for their development and research pipelines. So it's a really, really big part of the UK's kind of economy. And what Stephen was saying before about how we can make that translate into the future, I think is really important. Now, the problem we've now got with UK spaceflight is we've had a bit of a catastrophe. And that's not to kind of mince words about it. There's a lot of people who still do the happy clappy thing and say it was a big success. And, for Spaceport Cornwall, who everybody associates Spaceport Cornwall with Virgin Orbit. They're not the same thing. Spaceport Cornwall themselves are a separate entity to Virgin Orbit. Now, Virgin Orbit, obviously, they had a pretty catastrophic failure in January. No matter how you paint the picture, the aircraft took off, the rocket was dropped, it fired its boosters, it got up to the edge of space, as it were, and then something happened. We now know it was a filter that had failed and dislodged, and then it came crashing back down with quite a number of satellites on board. You're looking at anywhere between I believe 6 commercial and 3 defense satellites on this rocket at its first attempt. The problem with that is that it kind of really put a damper on UK launch as it was at that point, but worse was to come, as it were. Virgin Orbit then, don't forget, Virgin Orbit been going for about 5 or 6 years, and they've been floated on the US stock exchange, quite high numbers in terms of their original float value, etc. That value was decreasing all the time. They were burning through cash, and they literally were hemorrhaging cash, to the point where in March this year, they suspended all operations and furloughed all of their staff. Now, they said this was a temporary measure and that they were going to bounce back. Turns out it wasn't, and only a few days later, they announced that they'd fired 675 out of, I believe, 850 in their workforce. So pretty much their entire workforce was gone. So if you haven't got the engineering staff and you haven't got the staff to actually develop and design and build and test the rockets, you're not going to be making rockets. And since then, subsequently, they've gone into filing for Chapter 11, which is full bankruptcy, receivership. So that's basically, unless some very rich benefactor who thinks he's going to make an absolute mint out of a difficult to achieve launch system. And it's not to take anything away from Virgin Orbit, they did a remarkable thing. It was kind of akin to the old X-15s in the 1950s, 1960s, where you'd have a pilot in an aircraft which was dropped from beneath a B-52, airliner, as it were, jet bomber, as it were, and then would fly off at 4,000 plus miles an hour, again going to the edge of space. Some of the people who flew it did get their astronaut wings. So it's not new technology, but it was relatively new for what was being attempted here in terms of putting small satellite payloads into an equatorial orbit from the UK and being the first. And this is another annoying thing, I think, with this whole UK wanting to be the first to do something. Well, the UK is one of the only countries in the world that's had a space industry on multiple occasions and shut it down on multiple occasions. In the late 1960s, we had a burgeoning space industry, and we launched a satellite from the Woomera test range in Australia called Prospero. Went up and was fantastic success, but then the government culled it. Now, the government this time are putting a lot more money and investment into the UK space infrastructure because they can see it as being beneficial to the economy. But the future of UK spaceflight is now really heavily based upon Scotland and what's happening up in Scotland, not so much England anymore. Spaceport Cornwall are now in discussions with people like Sierra Nevada Corp, who are another horizontal launch capable company. And this is the problem with Spaceport Cornwall. It's not really a spaceport, it's an airport, it's a UK airport. So you don't have a launch range perimeter like, and we'll go on to SpaceX in a minute, where a vertical takeoff range, you've got to be several miles or, even with small rockets, quite some distance away from the vertical launch site. And then you've got to obviously have different range safety approaches, etc., to when you're launching and what can be in the sky and the sea around you. With this, it was a conventional jumbo, conventional 747 that would take off from a conventional airport, fly out over the Atlantic, do a loop around kind of off the Canary Islands, drop the rocket, it would fire up, happy days, but not so happy days. The problem that we've got now is that this was the only equatorial launch capability for the UK. And given that a lot of the satellites, not all, but a vast majority of the satellites that are, heavily commercially based and focused tend to be in equatorial orbits. So this is why Cape Canaveral, Kourou, places like that are preferred launch sites, because it's very easy to launch a rocket vertically into an equatorial orbit from those positions. From the UK at 51 degrees plus latitude, up to northern Scotland, where you're looking at quite a high latitude there, the only options we've got are to launch into what's called a polar or sun-synchronous orbit, where the spacecraft goes up and the orbit goes around the top of the poles. Now, that's fine if you're doing things like Earth observation work, which is a huge part of the UK space sector. In fact, we're brilliant at this. We are some of the best scientists in Earth observation in the world are based in the UK, some of them based even at Harwell, where Stephen's offices were. And that kind of orbit is really important for, as I said, Earth observation for spy satellites, for example. So, people like the Ministry of Defence and NATO allies, they could be really interested in this launch capability. But when you look at what North America's got, they've got launch sites, in Alaska, they've got Vandenberg, they've got the Cape, they've got a whole trench of different launch sites. And even some of them are still struggling in terms of getting the number of launches that they need to become commercially viable and realistically financially viable. Because what SpaceX have done is completely crash the party with everyone globally around the world in terms of space. And we'll go on to that in a minute. I don't know what your thoughts are, Stephen, but the whole focus now is really on Scotland, and the geopolitical situation with Scotland is that Scotland still wants to become an independent country from the UK. It wants to effectively devolve plus. It's kind of independence referendum. They want complete independence from the UK. So at that point, if you've got all of your launch sites up in Scotland, you don't have a UK launch capability. You have a Scottish launch capability. I don't know what your thoughts
I think I agree with so much of what you've said, and it does in a way feel like history is repeating itself, because the UK had a successful launch program back in the 60s, something that actually made it to space. It was done on the cheap. It was cheaper than Apollo, and then we scrapped it. And what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm kind of getting a sense of is that we only had the stamina to see if this launch vehicle worked once. If it worked once, then okay, yeah, maybe we'll do another flight. But it feels like there's like a lot of pullback now from launch and distancing from launch and saying, hey, we're going to keep going this route. I think when any country says, hey, we're going to do launch, they need to take in that this is going to be a commitment from the government. There's, like you were talking about, from a commercial viability perspective. I mean, not even Elon Musk is, commercially viable with SpaceX without government contracts. I mean, most of the contracts that he gets are from the government. A lot of his early stage work came from government contracts. And if a nation wants to have that capability. They have to basically say, we're in it to win it. We're going to be committed to this. We're going to put in a set amount of money so that you can develop the talent, keep the talent, constantly be putting into it. You can't just kind of try to push the button once and then go away. So I think as much as I would love to see launch happen from the UK, I think it's a great capability. It's a capability we should have. I don't see the commitment yet to really kind of see it through and the resilience. I mean, if you take a look at just what happened last week with Starship, it's almost like the exact opposite response to what do you do when something fails. So Starship goes up. We all knew it was going to blow up. All of us in the industry were convinced. I mean, it just never been tested, so of course it's going to blow up. This is like pretty much any rocket ever tested blows up.
Yeah, but you say that, but then you look at the space shuttle. STS-1 had never been flight tested, and they put a national hero on it as well.
This is true. That we do have some exceptions to that, but I think that the fact that SpaceX is already like, hey, look, we've ruined our launch pad. We've, all these things are going wrong. We're going to try to launch again in 1 or 2 months. They're already building the next one. And that's the kind of attitude one needs to have if they want to make launch a viable success in any nation state.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. One of the people in the audience is Chris Lee, who formerly was one of the senior science people at the UK Space Agency and has a lot of background and experience in this. And I know Chris and I have talked many times about, the launch viability versus the UK. It's this perception that everything has to be astronauts, or this perception that everything has to be about the big noises in space, where the UK does so much of space so well. As I said, instrumentation, you only have to look at the James Webb Space Telescope. One of the primary instruments on that, the MIRI, was developed in the UK, and it was the first one to be delivered. We've got a phenomenal track record in so many areas of space exploration. The farthest object ever to land on another world being the Huygens lander, the key instrument that first hit the surface of Titan, was developed in the Open University, out of Leicester in the Open University. It's remarkable what we do, but we seem to it's almost like a dismissal of that in this kind of great quest. And as you said, if the financial investment isn't there, then we've gone through how many different government ministers for, once the UK Space Agency kind of lost some of its chutzpah to BEIS, which is the big government business and industrial strategy sector, it kind of took away some of the real impetus of what the UK space sector was trying to do in many respects. But in other respects, it was kind of trying to solidify it into a commercial business. But then the amounts of money that were being thrown in, you talk to people like Lockheed Martin, etc., and they were trivial amounts of money that they were being given to invest in what was supposed to be this big thing, this big launch capability. And you only have to look at the launch costs for Artemis, for example. Figures have been banded around anywhere between $2 and $4 billion per launch for the Artemis rocket. Now, we're not looking like that. We're not obviously going for that kind of level, but you look at Peter Beck in New Zealand with Rocket Labs and the success he's made of it in terms of national pride, more than anything, in terms of he's put a spaceport together, he's got commercial launches working, he's got his rockets reliable and working. He's now looking at reusability, and obviously everybody has to look at reusability, not only from the environmental perspective, but as we're going to go on to with SpaceX, the costs that they are now able to deliver. The UK space industry for launch, it's ridiculous. You could have got a Peli case. Most of the satellites that are on Launcher 1 were small CubeSat or slightly larger than CubeSat-based satellites. You could have got a Peli case, flown over to the United States on a Virgin Atlantic flight, got it in a SpaceX payload, and still had a holiday in the Bahamas for 3 weeks, and still saved a ton of money. There was a huge debate about from Space Forge, for example, where they were kind of misquoted because it wasn't them that said it, but the end result was that everybody said that the UK launch industry was toxic. You can't even begin to think about using it because the regulatory hoops that you have to go through and the licensing hoops, etc. I know Chris is saying in the chat there, FAA will ban SpaceX for many months. Absolutely. And they should do, Chris. You're absolutely spot on there. We'll go on to this in a minute, but with what SpaceX did. But between the FAA and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Aviation Authority in the US, they've been licensing SpaceX pretty much carte blanche for a long time now. They did one of their launches in the fog and it blew up, for a few hundred meters above the pad. SpaceX aren't averse to failure, but as you said, Stephen, the difference is that they've got the financial backing to sustain it. They've got, between Musk and one of the richest people on earth, and as you said, then the US government contracts. He has got the ability to almost act like it's an agile software development program where, fail fast, fail often, keep going. I don't know if you've got any
No,
more
I
thoughts on
think
that.
you summed it up great. I mean, I want to see the future of UK spaceflight. I want to see it. I think we need to really look hard at how we're going to go about making that sustainable, and know that it's going to take a commitment that, I just don't know if we were, at least at this point, ready to do. At least I haven't seen it.
I have to agree. I mean, one of the ironies, we talked about this dissolution between what happened with the UK Space Agency and some of their primary, not powers as it were, but the primary interests as it were, being taken away and put into the government-based department. And we've had some good ministers of state in the past, political, machinations aside, and whoever you support in terms of the party, there have been some extremely good ministers of science in this government and in previous governments, all throughout the years, who've done phenomenal things in terms of backing the UK as a sector, things like the square kilometre rate, etc. All of this, David Willetts being a prime example of somebody who really was very much behind and understood the space sector. Then you get people like Jacob Rees-Mogg involved, and it's almost laughable. I was laughing with people at Spaceport Cornwall saying, "What are you going to do if Mogg turns up for your launch?" It was almost beyond a joke. It is having proper government commitment and proper investment, as it were, that I think will make this a success. But then you go up to Scotland and you think, well, hold on, they've got potentially up to 5 launch sites. That's as many as the continental United States. In Scotland, on a polar and sun synchronous only launch
business
orbit.
case close.
I mean, unless press.
I mean, what's interesting too, when just maybe making one more kind of comment about Virgin. I don't know if you remember, but I think you asked me on air a few years ago, where would I put my money in terms of where are we going to go with human spaceflight? And I actually put my money on Virgin. I think Virgin Galactic, has the best chance of being successful, at least in the near future, for tourism. That's what I said a few years back. But one of the things that's really interesting in the space industry that I think maybe people don't appreciate is that in order to make space commercially viable, you have to have more than one market. You cannot completely rely solely on low Earth orbit, for example, like you have with Virgin Orbit, and you can't solely rely on tourism like you have with Virgin Galactic. That's why the case was to have them together. It's interesting that they had split those two things up, but it's the same kind of issue with Scotland. Like you've got, first of all, is there really a need for 5 launch pads? Probably not, but I can see the rationale for the competition and trying to get there. Actually, my hat's off to them for doing that. But I think what will be very tricky is that there's a very small market for polar orbit. There's a market, and it's something that could possibly be done better in Scotland than other launch sites. But if that's the only game in town, it's gonna require some government resilience. And to your point earlier, if Scotland does decide to secede, which there's a lot of indicators that might be the case, they've got to get the fortitude and the money to say, hey, we're gonna make this happen. We're gonna push this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So watch, as we always say, watch this space, as it were, with the future of UK spaceflight. But I was talking only today, actually, to Dr. Heidi Tiemann. She sent out one of the space skills surveys, and it's really interesting. You look at those, and the questions and the types of questions that are being asked, and it's a big. We did a big study quite recently in work for something completely different in terms of defence, but again, that lack of SQEP, as it were, that's coming through, because a lot of the larger primes, as it were, that have got the vast experience with so many big commercial big defence programs, for example, in the past, that's an aging population, as it were, when it comes to developing new skill sets and bringing people through. And it's a shame that, you know, the UK Space Agency sometimes don't really sell UK space in the best way to the younger people, and you know, things like the failure of Virgin Orbit again is going to make people think possibly twice about, you know, a future in that. Some people may see it differently. Some people may think, well, you know, there's something happening here, and there is. You know, there's a reason why Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and various other, you know, multi-billionaires have got space companies. You know, they can see, and they're investing in it, and they can see that there is potentially a future if we don't end up trashing Leo, which is a whole other topic. Anyway, moving on. Next slide. Next slide, please. If we just go on to that. I'm just looking at what's happening in the chat at the moment. So it brings us neatly onto SpaceX. Now, SpaceX, as Stephen's he's listened to many of these shows with Terry and I. I've got a massive love-hate relationship with SpaceX, always have had. The love-hate relationship is you've got to love the technology of what they're developing. You know, watching Falcon 9s, Falcon Heavies, etc., land autonomously on a barge in the middle of the Atlantic is a remarkable technical achievement. You cannot deny that in any way, shape, or form. Watching the Falcon Heavy land 2 cores in parallel was a phenomenal technical achievement. Again, you can't argue with that. You can't take away from that at all. What he's trying to do now is obviously this big vision, big goal that Elon Musk has always had of sending, you know, humans to Mars, for example, which again is an admirable goal in terms of human exploration. And there's a whole raft of arguments from Professor Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, as to whether or not we need human exploration at all in the future. I'm of the kind of era and ilk that thinks, well, Apollo did so much in terms of galvanizing humanity and getting people interested in space, that the human interest element is always something that I think will get more people involved. You know, you only have to look at Tim Peake. The Tim Peake effect for UK space and UK schools was quite significant. So nobody remembers when the first robot landed on the surface of Mars, or, you know, when the first robot landed on whatever. You know, they know that it was Viking 1, but everybody knows when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. It's that kind of thing. So this idea of sending the largest space rocket ever designed or developed off into, obviously, its first test flight and then onwards to the moon and onwards to Mars, because obviously SpaceX are very heavily involved in NASA's new Artemis program, and they're developing the landing mechanism, which is a whole other ballgame again with this, was really interesting. And we saw for the first time ever this 400 feet high rocket generating 17.1 million pounds of thrust take off from Boca Chica in Texas. And it was remarkable to watch it lift off the pad. This thing had 33 Raptor engines, clustered in a way very similar to the Russian N-1 rocket, which was Russia's answer to the Apollo program with the Saturn V. They, you know, Sergei Korolov's original design. Sadly, Korolev died before he could kind of see it go up, and boy did it go up. I mean, it blew up on the pad with the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history. Then it blew up just after takeoff with another spectacular explosion. It killed lots of people in the first instance. Musk has now developed this kind of idea again of clustering engines. So rather than like on the Saturn V, we had the 5 independent F1s that were able to gimbal and adjust, etc., and they were generating around about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. This thing is an order of magnitude bigger. Not in terms of physical size. Obviously, it's slightly taller, so it is technically now the largest rocket ever to lift off from the ground, but not to be successful. It's not gone into orbit. It's obviously blew up. Chris is saying Sir Martin is not against human exploration, rather than, well, I'll argue that with you, Chris, and we'll argue that probably on Twitter, because I've heard Sir Martin really argue against it. And I remember one of my lecturers at Birkbeck, whose name escapes me right now, having a major argument with Sir Martin about this. Anyway, we'll go back to that in a minute. Hey, so SpaceX, live fast, die young, as it were. They keep going, and you only have to remember the early days of the original Falcons. They were blowing up quite a significant number of those, but obviously in the early days of NASA, the Jupiter program, etc., they were blowing up lots of rockets as well. Space is hard. Let's make no bones about it. Space is hard. We only have to look at Hakatu K R. So Yeah, the Japanese one today. Sorry, only just happened, and we'll get onto that in a minute. But it's hard to do any aspect of space. Now, he managed to get it off the ground, and then very soon after it came off the ground, it was very obvious that something was going wrong. It came off at a kind of slightly weird angle, but everyone thought, well, okay, the Saturn V didn't do a completely vertical takeoff; it kind of arced and gimbaled away. Obviously, to clear the tower, etc., it was kind of arcing away when it was going up into orbit. So people didn't think much of it for probably about the first 45 seconds. And then when you got a first look at the Raptor engines, you saw that several of them had gone. They were no more. And then there was puffs of smoke coming out and little mini explosions seemingly come out of it. And then somebody saw in one of the videos, like the first and second stage intersections where there was something went wrong there. And then the aftermath. This is the bit that, I mean, Chris has alluded to there with the FAA and the FCC probably not going anywhere near allowing them to launch again for some time. They cratered the site. And by cratered, I mean cratered. Elon Musk had taken an executive decision apparently about 3 years ago that he didn't need a flame trench, that he was going to try and launch a 17 million pound thrust rocket, larger than 2.5 times the size of a Saturn V, off a launch pad that was a reinforced concrete and steel pedestal, into the air, and hope that nothing. Professor Ian Crawford, yes, thank you very much, Chris. Just remind me. Launch it off into the air, and nothing was going to go wrong. If you've seen the videos of what went wrong, basically they put a gigantic hole in the ground underneath the launch site. The best bit, though, was they managed to get large lumps of concrete, some of them the size of big blocks, like huge, great big blocks, flying off at hundreds of miles an hour, and they trashed low loaders, cars, most of the car park, most of the launch site area, ruptured or almost ruptured some of the tanks that held the propellant in near the launch site. And his response was kind of like, oh, oopsies, made a mistake, which the arrogance beggars belief. But then you've got to admire the fact that he's going to try again. But as Chris has alluded to in the chat, whether or not he's allowed to for some time is a whole other matter. I don't know. Did you watched it, Steve?
Yeah, no, I watched it in all of its glory, and it's interesting because I wonder. So one of our good friends, Chris Lee, has mentioned in the chat that it's going to be banned by the FAA, FCC for a while. And I do agree. I think that there will be that, that's already happened and it's going to stay that. But it's interesting because if you look at this from a different angle, there is a huge, effectively, jobs program that SpaceX enables. There is a huge amount of economic benefit that comes from launching these vehicles. So it'll be interesting to see how long these bans actually last. Because there's a lot of interest in, from an economic perspective. Not to also mention that there are other interests in the actual system and the system working from governments. So it will be really interesting to see how long that actually lasts. I think also, just again to my earlier point, what's so fascinating. You mentioned this love-hate relationship. I think 99% of us in the space industry have this love-hate relationship with Elon because I mean, he is probably right that we need to get off the planet. I think he's probably right that, the amount of time that humanity has been alive and, in this kind of like perfect swirl of being able to be here, it's like, wow, if we're going to keep our species, we need to learn how to not live here and live in other places. And so, and I think he, with a passion, feels that urgency, and hence the drive and the, like, I'm just not going to give up. This is my life work. And I think, in a way, we've got to love him for that because the ton of benefit from a technology perspective. But just like you were alluding to with the crater and that was left, there is a unintended consequence of progress, an unintended consequence of technology, where we didn't even mention the environmental impacts that you have by launching rockets regularly. You know, they're not clean, right? You know, we talk about green
Yep.
propellants, and I mean, it's still not green. Um, it's there are there's this kind of interesting balance that you have to strike and say, hey, well, do we as humanity, do we want this enough that, what, we're going to go ahead and take the fact that we've just destroyed all these cars and put a whole bunch of people's lives at danger? Because, like, let's face it, there's a lot of things that could have gone horribly wrong. Luckily they didn't. Are we
Yep.
willing to take that risk? Are we willing to say, hey, you know what, that the pros outweigh those cons? And I think, well, for certain, Elon is like, absolutely. And I think he's done a really good job of getting a lot of buy-in on all areas of the spectrum in politics, in America, in Americans' hearts. So I just see that momentum continuing, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see the next launch within 6 months.
It is really interesting. Elon always reminds me, and when I worked surrounded by keyboards here, we used to work in the music industry. We had some dealings with Steve Jobs and Apple, and very, very similar mindset. He had a very strong vision, very driven, didn't care really who got in his way or who he upset in the process. I think with Elon, it's slightly different as well, in that he has almost got the US government over a barrel, in that he is their only option for launch to orbit for the International Space Station. He is their primary launch option now if they want to get, defense, they can do defense payloads, etc., at a relatively low cost. I know you've got United Launch Alliance and various others out there, but at the cost, when Starship becomes fully operational, we're talking somewhere around about $180 per kilo into orbit. Now that's insane.
That's
Only a few years ago, it's nothing. It's like it's a night out for a meal for some people. It's absolutely trivial. Compared to the $20,000 to $50,000 per kilo we were looking at only a few years ago. So what he's able to do is drive down the cost, and obviously in the same way that Henry Ford did with the car, and Boeing did, all sorts of different companies all throughout history have monopolize something to such an extent that they've driven it down, and it's taken others, and it's still taking others a long time to catch up. NASA haven't caught up. European Space Agency are years away from catching up in terms of the commercial model of this. It's interesting as well, going back to the chat Chris is saying about did Musk go against his own engineers? That is the story that's going around, and the tweet that he put out in 2020 seems to back that up, that he said, we're going to see if we need one. I don't think we need a flame suppression system, and a big 2.5 million litre deluge of water coming in. It's also what Chris is saying, interesting about the science interest in this, and this is a big thing. And that again goes back to the love-hate relationship with Musk. Because what you're saying, Stephen, is right. I love his vision for exploration. I don't like the idea of putting 2,000 hippies on the surface of Mars. I wish that the first people, if we are going to land boots on Mars and we land human beings on Mars, I'd like it to be similar to the Apollo program, where we've got scientists, where we've got, okay, they weren't scientists, they were jet pilot, test pilots, but with a scientific goal. From first landing, yes, geopolitical goal, but then by Apollo 17, sending up Harrison Schmitt, sending up a real geologist, there was a scientific goal there, and I'd love Mars to have truly scientific goals as its first remit, rather than just, let's see if we can colonize it. Because there's so much we could lose by doing that, in terms of, putting, as they said in the Andromeda Strain, the movie, the dirtiest thing in the universe, us, on the surface of a pristine biological environment. Superb movie, really good. I mean, it's Michael Crichton is the guy who gave us Jurassic Park and Westworld, so yeah, it's amazing. But yeah, the scientific interest. This is the thing. This thing has got a over 100-ton to orbit launch capability. So what that could potentially do for things like space telescopes, we've had to, or NASA Goddard and various other entities involved have had to develop the James Webb Space Telescope in such a way that there were so many things that could have gone wrong with that, and that was tested to death, and it cost billions to do all of the testing and retesting, and even in the end, it was so large you couldn't do a full integration test on the entire system. There was no vacuum chamber on the planet that was even big enough. There's some enormous ones in the United States. There wasn't anything there. So having that kind of huge fairing where you could put gigantic space telescope, you could put something multiple times the size of the Hubble. And you only have to look at what the James Webb, and we'll go on to this again in a minute, what the James Webb has been doing in terms of rewriting science as we know it. Literally rewriting, what we know about galaxy formation right now, and the earliest part of the universe as we know it. What could we do with this? But then you go back to what you were saying about us becoming a multiplanetary species. If he carries on at the rate he's doing, we won't be going anywhere. Because the love-hate part of my love-hate relationship is Starlink, and all of the others that are now playing catch-up with Starlink. It's not just him; he's just the biggest player in town. But you got OneWeb, you got Bezos. China have now announced that they're going to put 13,000 satellites of their own constellation into low Earth orbit, and they're going to have a microwave capability. This is from the Chinese government, that they're going to be able to take out things that they don't want in their orbital path. So we're going back to the Reagan era of Star Wars in one respect, but we talked about this many, many, many times on the show. The whole thing with the debris storm that could occur. If that happens, and this is the irony of it, it's Musk that's going to be partly to blame.
No, absolutely. One other point I wanted to add that I think to add on to something you were saying around the Starship is one could ask the question, does the UK need the Starship? So, and what I mean by this is one of the big new pushes in our industry now here in the UK is space-based solar power. And for those who don't know, space-based solar power is the idea of effectively having gigantic solar arrays, for lack of a better word, up in space outside of the atmosphere and then beaming that energy back to Earth. The technology to do that requires football fields upon football fields of size to be in space. And how would we, just to your point about James Webb Space Telescope, I mean, that thing is gigantic and we fit it in this incredibly small fairing. How in the world would we possibly make space-based solar power work without something large like the Starship? I mean, it enables some of these things that we think might possibly be the solution to some of the energy crisis that we have here on Earth. What is your thought on space-based solar power?
But then, I know, because like Mike Curtis Rouse, somebody we both know very well, who's based in Harwell, is one of the key people behind the push on space-based solar power. And yes, it has got some really interesting potential, as it were. But then you go back to the astronomers, for example, and if you're putting 400-meter wide solar arrays into orbit around the Earth, what's that going to do to sky surveys? What's that going to do to deep space, observations from ground-based telescopes like OWL and the ELT, etc.? It's going to decimate. I mean, it's already.
It goes back to the point about the unintended consequences of our industry and that balance that we have to strike. We really need to be having these debates and thinking about these things. And I think Chris, loving the questions and loving the promise of a beer. I look forward to drinking that beer with you.
He owes me a coffee. We only live up the road from each other.
But the question is, any planetary science worth a life? I mean, you have there's all these kind of balances that we have to do in terms of is it worth us having satellites in space for climate change because it's contributing to some of the climate change problems? I personally think yes, it is worth it because I think the pros outweigh the cons. Because we wouldn't know what's going on with our climate without satellites. But to your point about now we're putting thousands of little itty bitty satellites in space, not thousands, tens of thousands of these. We might not be able to ever leave our orbit.
Well, that's the problem with Starship as well. With 140-ton launch capability to Leo, he could put 300 to 400 Starlinks in one of them.
And imagine that blowing up in low Earth
he's
orbit.
Currently launching
and then
50.
All the debris field that creates.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's one issue. Going back to Chris's question, that is an interesting one. Is any planetary science worth a life? I was in a meeting at UCL. This is going back, I forgot when Sean O'Keefe was the administrator at NASA, but Kevin Fong, who we all know and love, brilliant, science communicator, excellent, medical background as well, fantastic doctor, did wonderful things during the pandemic, in terms of going back into the NHS and doing that. So my hat really does tip to Kevin Fong, and he's got a new series. He did an amazing series on Apollo, on kind of the Apollo 13 mission and various Apollo missions. And he's got another one going now for the space shuttle. If you haven't listened to Kevin, he's fantastic. He's really, really good. But Kevin Fong was at this meeting, and I remember asking, when is Sean O'Keefe going to be fired? And he looked at me as if to say, what do you mean? And I said, well, this is the guy who's basically scrapped the servicing missions to the Hubble. Now, yes, it would have been cheaper to launch another Hubble. Everybody knows that. It would have been far more cost effective not to repair them. There's all sorts of reasons why the Hubble was fantastic, but it wasn't fantastic in that it could have been done so much cheaper in terms of repair missions, etc. But there were people like Mike Massimino, various other astronauts, who decided that their lives were worth it for the advancement of science. And lest we forget, the Hubble has generated more scientific research papers than pretty much anything else in history. And if that, only a 450-kilometer orbit was worth multiple crews, and it wasn't just the one crew, it was multiple crews. And don't forget, they'd seen their colleagues and their friends die on Challenger and Columbia. For them to still say, yes, I think this is worth it for the advancement of science and human exploration, I think it is worth a life. And we may be feeling different about this. If Apollo 8 at Christmas in 1968 had gone really, really badly wrong, and we'd have had still Frank Borman and Jim Lovell and Bill Anders orbiting the moon to this day, in basically a gigantic frozen coffin, we probably would have felt very different. We didn't lose any astronauts. Apollo 13 was an amazing achievement in terms of bringing them back. We have lost astronauts in space. The Russians, famously hid a lot of their, early failures with some of their early, space stations, and some of the issues they had. And we've lost obviously 14 crew with the space shuttle. I think what will change everyone's minds, and I've talked about the Titanic effect, the issue with low Earth orbit and the debris storm, given the increased commercial interest, and as you said about Virgin Galactic wanting to put more tourists up there, and you only have to look at Sierra Nevada Corp with their mini X-37B style aircraft that they're planning on launching. Somebody's going to die on orbit. Make no mistake about it. Somebody, either on an EVA on the ISS, if the ISS is up there for much longer, who knows? But somebody is going to die. It's not if, it's when. It's going to happen, because somebody's going to be hit by a piece of debris. And lest we forget, something the size of a grain of sand traveling at 8 kilometers a second would tear straight through most people. It's not going to stop. It's just going to, if you've got something the size of a cannonball, it'd take out the ISS completely. That goes straight through the cupola. It could, depressurize the whole thing. It could go through. I know it's shielded and it's got better shielding than most spacecraft, but that debris storm's only getting worse. More and more collision avoidance events. Hugh Lewis at the University of Southampton recently put forward a kind of a projection of where this was going. We're already at 26,000 collision avoidance events per month. We're looking at, hundreds of thousands to millions within the next 20, 30 years. So somebody's going to die. And I call it the Titanic effect because it's the same thing. It's like everybody said, oh, you can't sink the Titanic. We don't need those lifeboats. And then it goes and hits an iceberg and everybody dies, or most people die. So when that happens in space, it may change or may increase public awareness to not only, like David Attenborough did with plastic in the ocean and the climate crisis that we're experiencing right now. And only a report this morning came out about ocean temperatures rising at an alarming rate, and future El Nino events happening. It's going to happen, but at the moment the public don't know. There is no great public awareness for what space is. They'll have a laugh that Virgin Orbit crashed. There'll be memes and jokes and what have you. Or people will be disappointed. People would have seen the Starship launch blow up and go, well, he's blown up stuff in the past. And it's kind of like a passing care. And Artemis, the whole drive with Artemis is, putting people on the moon again and getting people inspired again. But lest we forget, after Apollo 11, Apollo 12, hardly anyone cared. People cared again with Apollo 13 because there was a crisis. So, moving on to our final topic. This has been great.
I think we need to get Chris Lee on this show. What do you think, Nick?
We do. I've always thought it'd be great to get various people from. We talked about Abby, who's one of the former Space Store crews, now gone on to her PhD, I believe. Really fantastic, and a knowledge on galaxy formation. And I think it'd be fantastic to kind of bring people in with different areas of expertise.
So many times at so many airports discussing many of these things. He has so many great opinions. Anyway, next topic.
Yeah, he's great. He is great. Yeah, so telescopes and on our understanding of the universe. So again, this goes back to what we were just talking about. And ground-based astronomy, the future of ground-based astronomy is looking really grim. putting it frankly, especially wide field sky surveys, you know, you only have to look at the square kilometre array and band 5B, which is now completely gone as far as the SKA is concerned. And Phil Diamond at the SKA initially was quite reluctant to criticize what was happening in low Earth orbit in terms of frequency bands being used, but now it's becoming more and more of a problem. And when China start launching tens of thousands of satellites, you know, with their sometimes blatant disregard for the rules and norms of space, who knows what's going to happen? So ground-based astronomy, the wide field sky surveys, Catalina sky survey, some of these sky surveys have got 50, 60 degree fields of view. And they're looking out for comets, asteroids, all the things that could potentially kill us as well. Or new objects out there. You know, we're looking for new and interesting things out in space, you know, supernovas going off, whatever. And if you're constantly having to filter out tons of crap flying in front of your telescope field of view, and if you put up 400-meter wide solar arrays, the reflectivity of those, given that they're solar arrays, is going to be, you know, even if you had them pointing at an angle there, they're capturing the sunlight and then they're relaying the thing back down, the energy back down, you're still putting something up there which a telescope, a ground-based observational telescope, is going to see. This is the clever thing that Musk did. He painted the starlinks, or kind of shielded the starlinks, so that they went to about magnitude 7. So nobody can see them. Out of sight, out of mind. It's like, well, you can't really, you can see them occasionally, you know, at sunrise and sunset, but they're not going across your field of view. But if you've got a telescope that can hit magnitude 24, like the Keck, for example, and you've got 200 starlinks flying across your field of view, and okay, the Keck's quite a small field of view, but some of the wider field survey telescopes, and like I said, OWL and ELT coming on board. The future of ground-based astronomy and our understanding of the universe, I think, is limited. So Musk's response and some of his fan club response was, well, we can put telescopes up into orbit. And yes, potentially we could, but is that really what we want? I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's and some of these programs have been, you know, in the making for decades, and so much money has been spent, and to see that they're going to struggle to be able to do the science that they anticipated doing because we're cluttering up space is sad. And yes, we could put more telescopes up in space, but let's think about that for a second. Like, the telescopes that we put in space are some of the most expensive things that we put in space. You know, take James Webb Space Telescope, take Hubble Space Telescope. Both of those, you know, grossly over budget, grossly expensive to the taxpayer. But was it worth it? And I think a lot of us would say yes, absolutely, it's worth it. Then how many more of these things can we afford? You know, like it really comes down to, you know, it is cheaper to do ground-based astronomy. I mean, it's repairable. You know, there's so many more kind of aspects of it that make it more it's accessible. And so, yeah, saying that, yes, we're just going to go put up more telescopes. Well, who's going to pay for that? You know, where's that going to come from? Because, you know, I'm sure there's, you know, already designs and people vying for what's the next Hubble, next James Webb Space Telescope. But we're still looking at like 20, 30 years away from now before that will even go up. And then to your earlier point, can we even get it up there? Because it has to fly through this massive debris field on the way up.
Yeah. And then if you put it out at far Lagrange points like we have with James Webb, if something were to, I mean, James Webb, everybody had everything crossed for that thing, because, you know, I think it was 140 potential failure points after it even started to deploy out of the fairing. So everybody was, you know, given the fact that, you know, you only have to look at the European Space Agency's success with Mars. They haven't had any. You know, they've put orbiters around Mars, but landing on the surface, space is hard, as we keep saying. You know, looking at the Japanese lander today, space is really hard. You know, they got to within a few meters of landing on the lunar surface and then lost all telemetry and something went wrong. No, right now, nobody knows. So getting something out to a, you know, L point, a Lagrange point like the James Webb, where you've got no service mission then. You've got no way you're going to be sending astronauts out, and refueling it. They're only now starting to look at, well, potentially we should have looked at robotic refueling, and not just refueling, but recryoing, for example, because the James Webb Space Telescope obviously relies on a lot of cryo coolant to keep the instrumentation at ridiculously low temperatures, just above absolute freezing, so it can do its job. So it's got a finite lifespan. And that reusability of telescopes, you look at the Hubble, the reusability element of the Hubble came from, the primary mirror, they fixed that, but then being able to upgrade the cameras, being able to upgrade the spectrometers, being able to upgrade all that using astronauts, change the solar panels even, because it was only at a 450-kilometer orbit, was totally viable. Now, if we go into robotic servicing and robotic missions like that, again, you talk about the space debris thing, and people like Astroscale and their various projects to change orbits and boost orbits and put things out into graveyard orbits that aren't going to be a problem is a really admirable goal. But then when Musk is launching at the moment 55 to 110 Starlinks a month, which is what he's doing, when Starship goes operational, hundreds, because he's got a license application for 38,000. I just don't know if we're going to have any capability.
What's interesting. I mean, it's kind of you mentioned Don't Look Up earlier, so which is another great film that I recommend everybody watch. That you have these, with climate change, for example. We know that it's happening. Like we know it's happening, and we know we need to do something to fix that. But there's a lot of people kind of along the way that are like naysayers, like, no, it's not. But like when you take things like the space program, I feel like, again, history's repeating itself. I mean, I'm a lover of space. Obviously, I care a lot about it. I think it does more good than it does bad. But we have to think about the unintended consequences of all these things that we're going to do. Just look at plastic pollution in the oceans. It's like the same that we see these problems coming. We are launching tens of thousands of satellites into orbit, and there's plenty of smart people that'll just tell you that can be very problematic. And I think, it's going to can be maybe to one of your earlier points. A lot of times it takes catastrophe for us to really say, wait a minute, should we really be doing this, or do we really want to rethink this? But
it's squirrel in the backyard catastrophe as well. If a squirrel dies in your back garden, you see it and you want to get rid of it and you want to do something about it. If a squirrel dies in the forest across the road or a mile away and you don't see it, you don't care. And that's the problem with the plastic in the ocean. Even though public awareness is still so huge, people are still going out and buying plastic water bottles. You look at some of the river systems in the Asia Pacific area, you can't even see the water for plastic. It's still happening because plastic was seen 100 years ago as the great savior of humanity and the thing that was never going to degrade, never going to break down. It was going to be there. But then the realization, like coal, like all these different things. But then you've got the commercial entities, the coal industry in the United States, the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, and the United States. They're just completely averse to allowing us to change how we drive cars, for example. And fair play to the UK government for saying, right, we're going to ban the sale of new cars, but the infrastructure is not there to handle the electric vehicles. And then you've got the whole issue with cobalt mining and using slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo to get the precious metals that we need to get that out. And then people say, well, we can go into space and we can mine precious metals or asteroids. Well, we seem to be almost it's quick win dollar solutions against long-term focus on what we really need to do for this planet. And given even the last 100 years, the advancement in society in terms of awareness through the internet, etc. Tim Berners-Lee, there's a lot to be thankful for the internet for in terms of raising public awareness about so many different things. But we seem to be nitpicking and arguing with each other about trivial things and like, whether or not, you like J.K. Rowling this week or whatever. It's not trivial to people. I'm not saying it's a trivial matter, but in the great scheme of things, in the great scheme of humanity and the survival of the species on this planet as a whole, it's like the geopolitical thing. Ed Mitchell said it really well, the Apollo 14 astronaut. It's like you'd want to take most of the politicians on Earth by the scruff of the neck, drag them to the moon and point back to the Earth and say, look at that, USOB. This is all we've got. Forget political borders, forget political boundaries. But yeah, it's going to take a catastrophe.
Yeah, no, and it's and Chris rightfully says, we're one crisis away from a strategy. It takes that to kind of kick us in the butt and get us there. Yeah, absolutely interesting to see how this is going to play out over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I'm still committed to the cause,
Yep.
though, that all of the good things that space has enabled and provided, and wanting to, just in terms of even looking at our understanding of the universe and how that's even changing right now, thanks to James Webb Space Telescope. I mean, it's just absolutely it's fascinating. But these kind of debates are absolutely important, and we need to be having them and discussing them.
Absolutely. It brings us a nice kind of way to round up. We've been an hour. It's flown by. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you to Chris and anyone else who's, I mean, we know we have anonymous people who don't like to chip in the chat. I know they are there because they tell me afterwards. But thank you so much for everyone who's listened. And, going back to what you just said there, Stephen, and going back to Space Store, this is the thing. We need more people like yourself who are encouraging the good things about space, encouraging kids to, look up, use their eyes, buy telescopes, look at what the universe is, pretend that they're an astronaut, put a spacesuit on, whatever. Anything that gets kids inspired by what is a really fascinating and wonderful, and I work in the space sector, the defense part of the space sector, admittedly, but it is fascinating. It's something I've had a passion about since my dad took me to see Star Wars at the tender age of 7. It's something that's never left me, and I know the same with you, Stephen. It's a passion. It's something we love, but we need a more balanced and nuanced approach, and I think wider public awareness as well of the benefits to them. Not just, oh, it's your sat nav in your car. It's really the benefits of what space can do for people, be it scientific, being our knowledge of the universe with the James Webb, etc., all the way down to, I can use my phone to call my auntie in Australia because there's a satellite up there that lets me do it. So on that, have you got any final thoughts?
Thanks for having me on the show. Can't wait to have Terry back. I absolutely love everything he has to tell us about astronomy and what to look up in the night sky. So look forward to maybe crashing the party again in a few episodes later. But thanks for having me.
No, real pleasure. And people like Chris, definitely I'm going to have a chat with the team, Latch and whatever, and we'll get more guests on, because this is really, I like this. This has really been good. This has been really different and interesting. So thank you. And back to Latch.
Awesome.
My football supporting buddy.
Awesome. Well, I don't think I have anything else to follow after that, but thank you again for another amazing show, and thank you to everyone who's joined us in the audience. Thank you, Chris, especially for contributing. I've tried to put in as many of your comments up on the screen as I can, but everyone else who are silent listeners, thank you also to you for joining in to our tonight's show, and we'll be back again in a month's time, and hopefully we'll have someone else on screen. Thank you so much, Steve, for stepping in, and Nick, as ever, thank you so much for another great show.
A real pleasure. It
Awesome.
really is.
Well, I'll leave you guys to it. Make sure you click the thumbs up if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel if you aren't. And I'll leave you guys to it. Take care. Have a good evening, and we'll see you guys again soon.
Thanks.
Adios, amigos. Bye. Hi, my name's Nick Howes, space enthusiast, author, writer, broadcaster.
Hi, I'm Terry Mosley, past president of the Irish Astronomical Association, lifelong astronomy and space nerd, absolutely fascinated by everything, both man-made and natural up there.
So every 2 weeks, Terry and I give you the latest, hottest news from space and human spaceflight, robotic spaceflight, and what's happening up in the skies. Please tune in to us every fortnight with the Space Store. Adios, amigos.
Bye.